Welcome to the final video in a three-part series from the Climate Smart Land Network, a Manomet Climate Services initiative. This is Part 3, Managing Forests in a Changing Climate, which outlines strategies for climate change adaptation in the context of forest management. Each video in this series corresponds to part of our Climate Change and Forestry Handbook. While this video provides a broad overview of the topic, we recommend the handbook for those interested in more detailed information, and as a way to interface with our archive of research bulletins. You can find all these materials online at climatesmartnetwork.org. This video will address 4 important aspects of managing forests in a dynamic climate. The first is understanding the importance of forests as a tool for mitigating climate change. Second, we will discuss how to accurately assess the potential risks to forests and forestry operations. Then we will outline some strategies for taking action to both reduce risk and capitalize on potential opportunities. And finally, we will conclude with a discussion about the best approaches for dealing with the various uncertainties discussed in parts 1 and 2 of this series. And we will revisit these to recap along the way. While this video focuses primarily on the topic of adaptation to climate change, the role of forests in reducing the severity and intensity of climate change cannot be overstated. Each year, roughly 35 gigatons of carbon dioxide, or CO2, are emitted from human activity around the world. But of all the CO2 emitted globally each year, only half actually remains in the atmosphere. The other half is taken up roughly equally between the land and oceans. There is some concern that these critical carbon sinks may eventually saturate, but so far, their uptake of carbon has remained steady. Of the land carbon sink, forests are by far the largest component, sequestering and storing large quantities of carbon. In the US alone, for example, forests sequester 15 to 20% of the CO2 produced annually by the burning of fossil fuels. There is incredible potential to increase or expand the capacity of forests as carbon sinks through afforestation, reforestation, and active forest management, all of which have been identified as part of mitigation strategies put forward by the various countries that signed on to the 2015 Paris Climate Accord. As the climate warms, maintaining and enhancing the CO2 sequestration and storage role that forests play will involve both minimizing mortality associated with changing forest stressors and maximizing growth potential as forest structure and species composition changes over time. This ability of forests to take up and store large quantities of carbon from the atmosphere is now being monetized through carbon markets, creating a new type of forest product. This includes both regulatory, or compliance, and voluntary markets. In the regulatory market, such as California's Cap and Trade program, certain industries have their emissions capped below total output, and if they cannot meet that cap through improved energy efficiency or other measures, they must purchase carbon credits to offset those emissions. Credits in this regulatory market are generally more rigorous and garner a higher price compared to the voluntary market, where credits are often purchased to offset corporate or personal emissions. This is a dynamic marketplace that continues to evolve, but presents some interesting opportunities for forest owners. So to recap, forests play a key role in mitigating climate change as one of the world's largest carbon sinks, and forest management has an important role to play in maximizing the climate regulation services provided by forests. Carbon is a new type of forest product that can be managed and sold in both regulatory and voluntary markets, providing a new opportunity that may be of interest to some landowners. Now we turn to the question of risk assessment. In reality, climate change presents a mix of opportunities and risks for forests and forest management operations, as well as situations where the impact depends on the region and species in question, among other factors, as outlined in Part 2 of this series. The goal is to have an accurate picture of these impacts, avoiding over or underestimation of the risks, so we can respond appropriately through planning and management. One challenge is that forests are not equally at risk at all times and in all places. The predominant climate change impacts vary from one region to the next, with some areas trending warmer and wetter, while others are trending toward warmer and drier conditions, and in some cases, these trends vary seasonally. The effects of increasing fire potential and severe drought, for example, are expected to be especially problematic across the southern and western U.S. whereas forests across the northern tier may be disproportionately affected by shorter and milder winters. It is useful to think of climate change adaptation as a form of risk management. So the question becomes how to accurately assess the risk posed to a particular region or forest type. And the degree of risk really depends on 4 factors. Probability, or the likelihood that a particular climate impact or extreme event will occur. Intensity, which is determined by the magnitude or duration of the impact. The exposure to the risk over space and time. And vulnerability, or the susceptibility, sensitivity, and degree of resilience to a particular climate impact. Breaking risk into its component parts reveals which factors contribute the most and the best ways to reduce it. Probability and intensity are related to the climate impact, such as drought or heavy precipitation. At an individual level, we cannot reduce these components of risk, but we can get more and better information to improve our assessment of risk. This is where it's important to understand the regional climate trends and projections in your area. On the other hand, exposure and vulnerability are related to the forest in terms of location, soils, stocking, species mix, and so on. By purposely focusing resources in certain places and using the right management approach, you can reduce exposure and vulnerability to a given climate stressor, which will reduce the overall risk to your forest. As an example, research indicates that the probability of drought is increasing over time, and the intensity of drought events is also increasing due to warmer temperatures that increase evaporative demand and plant water stress. A site with mostly well-drained upland soils may have an increased exposure to soil moisture drought over time. But through management, the mix of tree species on site could be shifted toward more drought-tolerant types, or a series of thinnings could be used to lower the density of the stand, both of which would decrease vulnerability to drought-induced dieback, and therefore the overall risk posed to this hypothetical forest by drought. So to recap, climate change poses different types and degrees of risk depending on the region and forest type. And this risk is determined by 4 factors related to the probability and intensity of the climate impact and the exposure and vulnerability of the forest. Good information about climate projections can improve risk assessment for a particular area, and active management can help reduce the exposure and vulnerability of the forest to potential climate-related stressors. Now from understanding risk to taking action. Rather than warranting an entirely new way of doing business, climate change can serve as a new lens through which we view forest management. A changing climate is now the context in which we practice forest management, and it belongs on the list of standard considerations, along with timber markets, invasive species, pests, and others. The goal is to manage or minimize the risks where possible, and capitalize on opportunities for increased forest growth and productivity. Carrying on with active, involved, and observant management that changes as needed is the best way to respond. And when considering possible adaptation actions, there are things you can do now and things you can do as part of longer-term planning. We'll discuss some of these actions next. An important area for action is in the realm of health and personal safety. Climate change has been recognized as a potential threat to human health by entities from the World Health Organization to the U.S. Centers for Disease Control. Health impacts in forestry will primarily affect field personnel in the form of increasing exposure to heat stress and disease. Changing climate has led to the expansion of a number of tick and mosquito-borne illnesses, including movement of these disease-carrying organisms into some new geographic areas. Some of these illnesses can be quite serious, so it's increasingly important that workers use effective repellents and dress to reduce their exposure while in the field. Heat exposure and associated dehydration can also impact field work. The link between heat stress and decreased worker productivity is well established, and exposure to moderate or strong heat stress is likely to increase across most of the U.S. over the next several decades. It will be important for field personnel to pay close attention to their condition and take necessary breaks, especially during the hottest months of the year. Some of the biggest climate-related management challenges, from an operational and cost perspective, are related to impacts on forest infrastructure. There's an increasing likelihood of forest disturbance that may need attention, and a well-maintained system of roads and trails that allows reasonably rapid access will be increasingly beneficial. And in regions where frozen ground is necessary for accessing wetter sites during harvest operations, an effort to design harvest plans that offer alternative access routes can address issues related to a growing inconsistency of frozen ground conditions. Changing precipitation patterns and heavy downpours are increasingly common as the climate warms, and the design and construction of forest road stream crossings must accommodate these changes. This includes designing crossings that are resilient in the face of higher flow events, and that minimize fragmentation of streams for aquatic species that may need to seek new cold water refuges farther upstream. Open bottom structures and temporary crossings work particularly well in this regard. The risk posed by climate change varies in part as a function of the characteristics of the forest and the particular site, as we noted in the previous section on assessing risk. This includes stocking level, species mix, presence and distribution of different age classes, the presence of early or advanced regeneration, and stand structure. These factors determine to what degree a forest is exposed to a particular climate-related stress, and how vulnerable it is to decline as a result. As a forester, it is these forest and stand level characteristics that can be altered to increase resilience or improve suitability for anticipated future conditions, such as thinning to increase drought resistance, planting species from genetic seed sources that are likely to perform well under future conditions, or utilizing an irregular shelterwood harvest to promote a diversity of age classes that may help dilute the risk of loss from any particular climate stress. Many of the issues associated with climate change have a longer time horizon and involve gradual changes that will play out over many decades. So it's particularly important to consider climate change as part of longer-term planning. One way to do this is to add discussion of climate change implications to management plans. Landowners with large ownerships may want to consider a nested plan approach, involving a regional, forest level, and operational plan, because different climate-related impacts are relevant at different spatial scales. For example, discussion of climate-driven changes in forest composition may be addressed in a regional plan, whereas discussion of the impacts of increasing heavy precipitation on stream crossings may be most appropriate in an operations plan. One of the most important tools for reducing uncertainty and informing management decisions is an effective forest monitoring system. Such a system can help detect whether changes are happening as expected and identify early warning signs of forest stress. This not only helps constrain projections, but also creates opportunities for managers to be more proactive in addressing climate-related issues as they arise. Monitoring and recording changing conditions through your existing forest inventory or some other monitoring system will yield valuable information, but there are also many useful existing data sources from state and federal agencies as well as universities, which can help paint a fuller picture of changing conditions at a regional level and augment information collected locally. To recap, climate change can be viewed as a new lens through which we view traditional forest management. It is the context in which we work. And there are things you can do to take action in the shorter term, such as protecting yourself against disease and upgrading existing stream crossings, as well as things you can do as part of longer-term planning and management, such as altering species composition over time to improve suitability to future conditions, or incorporating climate change into management plan updates. Foresters can improve the resilience or tolerance of the forest to changing conditions by influencing species mix, stocking levels, age class diversity, regeneration, and stand structure. A major challenge of climate change adaptation is dealing with uncertainty about future climate and ecosystem change, and this is especially true when considering near-term change at a regional or local level. In a big picture sense, forest management decisions fall along a spectrum, from deterministic to indeterministic, based on our assumptions about how well we can predict future conditions and our ability to design forests well suited for those conditions. A completely deterministic approach assumes we have reliable predictions of future climate and an ability to organize our forests successfully through management. The aim is to develop forests of the future, where the species mix and stand structure are well adapted to future conditions. By contrast, a purely indeterministic approach assumes future climate change is highly uncertain, and forests are constantly self-regulating with an innate capacity to adjust and withstand change. The aim is to create a diverse forest in terms of species, structure, age classes, etc., that has a natural capacity to buffer change. In a sense, a deterministic approach is focused on producing an adapted forest, one that is resistant to and tolerant of change, whereas an indeterministic approach is focused on producing an adaptable forest, one that is resilient and flexible. These strategies are not mutually exclusive, and managers will likely use some of each. The deterministic approach is often successful in shorter 10 to 15-year planning horizons and in less complex systems, whereas the indeterministic approach is often the most appropriate strategy when there's a high degree of uncertainty. Ultimately, the ability and desire to implement one approach or the other will depend on management objectives, risk tolerance, and planning horizon. We can illustrate the difference with the example of species selection. Taking a deterministic approach might involve planting or encouraging natural regeneration of a specific subset of species or varieties that are likely to perform well under future conditions, encouraging more drought-tolerant types in an area projected to become drier, for example. Whereas an indeterministic approach might involve encouraging a greater diversity of species and varieties that have different ecological traits in order to spread the risk and ensure that at least some component of the forest or stand will perform well under whatever future conditions prevail. So to recap, there is no one right way to manage for climate change. In reality, there are a spectrum of management options out there, from deterministic to indeterministic, and they're not mutually exclusive. Where your management actions fall on that spectrum depends on the level of uncertainty, your personal or organizational risk tolerance, and the planning horizon. But an indeterministic approach, aimed at improving resilience and flexibility, does have the advantage under conditions of high uncertainty. This concludes Part 3. Thank you for watching, and please access the companion handbook available at this link for references and more information.